Hi, welcome to episode 3 of Dress Histories with me. My short videos that just consider a different aspect of dress history, some of the things I've looked at over the years that I hope you enjoy. I'm going from the sublime to the ridiculous today. Having spoken in the first 2 episodes about women mountaineers in the second half of the 19th century and the things that they wore to climb, this is part of my doctoral research today about the surviving garments of Queen Alexandra. So seemingly completely different, although there are some surprising shared elements that we might look at another time. But who was Alexandra? So Alexandra was Queen Victoria's daughter-in-law. She married Edward, Victoria's eldest son, on March the 10th, 1863, to great celebration after years of Queen Victoria's retreat from public life. The life of the new Prince and Princess of Wales was to dominate the press. And so Alexandra became something of a style icon. And there are lots of her surviving garments in museums around the world. When I started, I knew of a handful from institutions and collections in the UK. But when I started to explore more widely, I found that they were everywhere. From Los Angeles to Tokyo to Sydney to Oslo, they are all over the world. In some ways it might make sense to talk about her clothes right from the off, but actually the question I'm often asked in relation to her wardrobe is, how did they come to be so well spread? Why are they all over the world? And actually, to answer that question, you have to look in the shadows of Alexandra's life at figures that very rarely get certainly any historical writings, but just don't really exist in the historiography at all, and that's the dresses. Much of the garments that survive of Alexandra's wardrobe that are now in these collections are there because of members of her royal household, and so those are some of the people that I wanted to look at today. People like this is Marianne Skerritt. Now, admittedly, Marianne Skerritt is not Alexandra's dresser, but she was the principal dresser for Queen Victoria for a very long time. And it's really unusual to have a sketch like this, to have an image of a member of the royal household. It's a beautiful picture, I think. There's, I think, lots of affection in this sketch. It's in the royal collection and is a rare survival for that reason, that you don't have members of the royal household very often being captured. Another book that you might be interested in reading is this one. Again, it's a kind of rare account. It's called My Mistress the Queen, and it is the letters of Frida Arnold, who was another dresser to Queen Victoria in the 1850s. It's a really interesting read about this hidden factor of royal life, of these women that rarely wrote about their experiences, certainly didn't speak about them, and so don't really get that recognition or the understanding of their role that we might now. So I was able to find out about a couple of Alexandra's dresses. Some of them, the records, I just couldn't find anything about them. But certainly 3 I knew about, and that was Harriet Giltrap and Bessie and Nettie Temple, who were 2 sisters who had originally come from the Sandringham estate. The role of the dresser is a fascinating one. There would be a number of dressers within the royal wardrobe. You would have the principal dresser, and then there would be a second and maybe even a third dresser, depending on the status of the royal. Alexandra had a principal dresser and a second dresser, and then she also had 1 or 2 wardrobe maids who would undertake some of the more menial tasks. The role of the dresser was to keep the workings of that royal wardrobe running as smoothly as possible. So not only did they take on the daily decisions about what Alexandra would wear, to ensure that everything was laid out ready, that any accessories that she needed were ready, but they also undertook the maintenance of that wardrobe. So things like arranging to have things specially cleaned if they needed it, to keep up running repairs, make small minor repairs, undertake a lot of cleaning themselves. That day-to-day cleaning that we don't really do anymore, but which people in the dressers positions were very skilled at. So spot cleaning, stain removal, odour removal, all of these things that they had techniques and strategies for that are really a loss to us in the 21st century. So the dressers were absolutely central to somebody like Alexandra's life in order to maintain the logistical everyday requirements of such a vast working royal wardrobe. They oversaw things like laundry as well. One of those really interesting aspects that I found about in my research was the existence of the Royal Laundry at Kew. It was actually built by Prince Albert and had a designated railway line running up to it. Garments from each of the royal residences would be collected each day and sent to the Royal Laundry from the various households, laundered there and then sent back to the individual households. And so when you see examples of this is Queen Alexandra's, a pair of her drawers actually that are in the in a university collection in Ohio, and you can see that it has her royal cipher monogrammed onto the drawers. This serves a really important practical function, which is that when garments are going away to be laundered, amongst multiple others, they can be returned to their rightful owner. So the laundry was another fascinating aspect, and one that was controlled by the dressers when these were concerns that Alexandra didn't need to worry about. But here you have a whole collection, a whole community of women, of hidden women really, who are managing this very complex wardrobe. And I think it's important not to downplay the significance of the wardrobe itself, for Alexandra is a very public figure who, without a political voice, would use her clothes to convey all sorts of different means of making public statements, and therefore the women who were helping to maintain that. Dressers became friends. In many ways, they were the women that were perhaps the closest to a figure like Alexandra. Ladies in waiting operated on a very different system. They operated on a kind of a rota system, and they would serve for, say, so many weeks on and then have so many weeks off to return to their families. So there's a greater degree of formality there. Whereas the dressers were there at the Queen's most intimate moments. They were there when she woke up in the mornings. They were there to help her dress and undress. They were there when she travelled. They were a constant presence in her life. And although her letters are few and far between that relate to anything like this, there's the occasional reference to the friendship, almost, if it could be called that, between these women. But how do the surviving garments relate to the dressers? Well, very often when Alexandra, as Princess of Wales and then later as Queen Consort, when a garment was no longer useful to her for whatever reason, not that it had worn out, but because maybe seasons had changed and she was buying different garments, she would gift items from her wardrobe to members of her household, primarily the dressers. And generally what happened over the years was that the dressers would hand these objects, these garments, down to their families, and then subsequently they have ended up in museums and collections or being auctioned. And that accounts, particularly in Alexandra's case, for why they are so well spread, because families have moved, they have been auctioned in different parts of the world, they've just ended up like flotsam and jetsam, being washed up in all sorts of different places, but largely because of the dressers. And one of the biggest auctions is actually really well documented. It took place in 1937 at the Anderson Art Galleries in New York. The seller was somebody called Samuel Wilson Soden, and when I looked at tried to find out more about him, I discovered that he was a court furrier on Regent Street. Now that doesn't mean he worked directly for the court. It meant that it was a kind of status that some makers, it meant that they might supply garments to people who were presented at court. So it wasn't necessarily a direct connection to the monarchy, but it was an indicator of making the most of status. Now, I don't know how he came to have acquired Alexandra's garments, but he had acquired almost 80 of them. There is a suggestion possibly that it was connected with Princess Victoria, who was Alexandra's youngest daughter, and she had died around 18 months before this. So I did wonder whether or not he had acquired them via Victoria, because one of the objects in the auction was Princess Victoria's coronation robe that she wore to her parents' coronation in 1902. So the auction took place in 1937. It was very well publicised. This is a newspaper clipping from the advertising for the auction that shows contemporary models wearing a couple of the garments from Alexandra's wardrobe. One an 1860s tartan crinoline, and the other an ivory satin dress trimmed with gold laurel type wreaths. It was advertising the auction taking place in the Anderson Art Galleries, and the catalogue that went with it also survives. Some of the garments were photographed, descriptions written of them, where they came from, when they were supposedly worn by the princess and later queen. And then we have the next train of events, which is knowing where some of these objects are. Around 24 of the objects were actually purchased by Irene Lewisone for the emerging costume, what's now the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the Met Museum actually have the largest single collection of Alexandra's objects in the world. And they include a whole range of things from stockings to outerwear to mantles to dresses. It's a really interesting range of objects. It does mean that there are a whole lot of them that still are unaccounted for. Some of them are in Toronto, and I have discovered one or two others from that auction, but a large number of them are still out there somewhere. If you know where they are, do let me know. We'll probably never know how Samuel Soden came to have so many of Queen Alexandra's garments in his possession. What I do know is that following Queen Alexandra's death in 1925, her dresser Harriet Giltrap did an audit of all the remaining objects in her wardrobe, and they were distributed after that. So indirectly, it all lands with the dressers. Many other of Alexandra's garments that are in different collections are there directly as a result of the dressers. The records demonstrate that they came directly from members of the family years later. So I hope you've enjoyed that introduction to the wardrobe of Queen Alexandra. There are many more stories about her fascinating royal wardrobe to follow.